how do you behave towards people who are more vulnerable than you? It's easy enough to behave in a particular way to people with more status and authority, but how do you behave to people who are more vulnerable when you're not being watched?
Hello, welcome to Transcending Boundaries. I'm Reeta Roy. My guest today is a remarkable trailblazer whose life's work has transformed the lives of millions of girls across Africa. Born in Cardiff, Wales, she began her career as an English teacher in London, working with students from marginalized areas of the city. And she witnessed firsthand the transformative power of education. In 1991, her graduate research in rural Zimbabwe led to a groundbreaking observation that parents wanted to send their children, including their daughters, to school, but it was poverty that was holding them back. Her insight and her determination to do something about it sparked a movement. That movement is called CAMFED. It's an organization supporting the education of girls and young women in Africa. CAMFED started with just 32 girls in Zimbabwe, and since that time has grown into a global force for advancing girls' education in Africa, reaching millions of learners. Her incredible journey has earned her numerous accolades, including an Order of the British Empire for services to education in Africa, an honorary doctorate from Cambridge University, an honorary doctorate in education from the Open University, and the prestigious World Innovation Summit for Education Prize. She's a celebrated speaker, a global advocate for social justice and equality. I'm talking about none other than Anne Cotton. Anne, welcome, and thanks for making time to be here with me and to talk to our audience about your life and the people who've influenced you and especially what you've accomplished. So I'd like to just go back to the past, actually go back to your childhood. You grew up in Wales, your beautiful parents who instill a deep sense of values, of service, of empathy. Would you share a little bit about your childhood?
Yes, well, thank you, Rita. This is a marvelous opportunity to share with you, and a real privilege. And indeed, it was a privilege to grow up in Wales, a land where poetry and song and music are really valued greatly. And I grew up in a household where I actually thought it was quite normal for your mother to sing Puccini arias while
Oh my
she was
gosh.
doing the housework, because she was in the Welsh National Opera Company, although she'd had a very, very difficult childhood. But there's a very beautiful hymn that I think sums up my mother, and it's called Calon Lan. And the lines go, Calon Lan, and Llawn Daioni tekach yw at nar lili gloch. And it means only those with a pure heart can sing in the morning and sing at night. And that really sums up my mother. She did have a pure heart, in spite of losing her mother at 7, in spite of a very unstable father. But she was greatly loved by her extended family, particularly by her aunt Anne, after whom I'm named. So yes, my parents grew up in adjoining mining villages in South Wales. Mining was the way to earn money. My father, while growing up in poverty, it was a very stable, loving home. And he used to watch the retired miners climbing the streets, leaning, to catch their breath, because their lungs were really shot through with the coal dust. And he was terrified of becoming a miner. So he studied so hard. And when he was 9, he was put in for the 11 plus scholarship, which he passed, but he was too young. So he had to wait a year. But for him, education was the way forward. Education was about security and the way out of poverty. And so that was the mantra, really, of my childhood growing up in Wales.
Amazing. Wow. Just imagine your mum singing around the house, your dad quoting poetry, something you said he loved poetry.
Yes, he was a real all-rounder. I mean, he studied chemistry. He got the mining scholarship to Aberystwyth University to study chemistry. Ironically, it was the mine owner of the mine where his grandfather was critically injured, as a result of which his mother left school age 12. So he got the scholarship, but he had a great love of Shakespeare and, the romantic poets. Yes, he was a real all-rounder, and he used to give us poems to learn. Say, right, the first one to learn this poem gets sixpence. He'd put the sixpence on the table, and we'd be halfway through reading it. He said, "Come on, ready?" And we'd say, "No, more time." Of course, he knew the poems off by heart. It took us a while. Must have been a little naive not to realize that.
Now, you won a scholarship as well to a private girls' school. What was that experience like?
I did. Well, I was in a school, at the local school. There were 51 children in my class. And I think I spent most of my time running errands or teaching other children to read behind the blackboard. And so my father was my real teacher. So when I got home, in the evenings, he would say, "The fire's on upstairs." He had a deep Welsh baritone. It's cost, 3 shillings or whatever it was. And off I would go to work. And that's when, he would be setting homework for me. So when it came to the 11 plus, yes, I won a scholarship to a prestigious girls' school in Wales. And I was the first in my school ever to win one. And I didn't know anybody in the neighborhood who went there. But it was an extraordinary experience, really.
Tell us more about how extraordinary.
Well, I spent the school holidays when we bought the uniform, which was very complicated and had all sorts of lacrosse boots and indoor shoes and outdoor shoes. And I was very, very excited. My father complained. He said, "This has cost me an entire month's salary." He spiced the fact it was a scholarship, but he was pleased I was going. So I used to dress up in it. I was so excited. But when I got there, I quickly realized I was a fish out of water because, girls came to school in fancy cars. We didn't have a car. We lived in a terraced house. We'd gone to Barry Island on our summer holidays, and one of the first things I did, a piece of homework from Mrs. Roberts, write, what you did in the summer holiday. So I duly wrote about our week in Barry Island, where we'd gone on bus, stayed in bed and breakfast, and it rained most days. And we went to the laundrette to dry our clothes, and went to see Samson Delilah twice because it was next to the laundrette. And I had thought we had a great holiday. I went to the slot machine arcades, and Mrs. Roberts came in and said she was going to read some of the best aloud. And I'd already realized that I'd made a mistake. And at the end of the reading, at the end of the lesson, a girl came up to me and she said, "Oh, you went to Barry Island for your holidays. I've never been there." Well, she wouldn't need to go to Barry Island because they had a car. So it was so much about me that I had to start hiding. I'd only been on a donkey on Barry Island Beach. Girls had ponies. So socially, I was out of my depths. Felt very excluded. And I began to withdraw. And I didn't do well academically, in those early years. So it was a very tough experience for me. The children, the teachers for the most part, I think, were very snobbish. They really valued those girls whose fathers, had status and were well known in Cardiff. So it was one of the hardest lessons of my life.
Yeah.
Yes.
And yet it's this experience of being excluded that we will come back to, because it's come to characterize some of your greatest work about creating inclusion. And I'll come back to that in a moment. Now, you finished school, went on to university, and you decided to become a teacher. And you found yourself in a state school. Mm-hmm. I guess it was also a rather challenging environment, but of a different sort. But here you are, a green teacher in the classroom. What did you encounter in the classroom, and what did you encounter in the corridors?
Yes. Well, I haven't, in fact, gone to university. I went to teacher training college.
You went to teacher training college.
I went there because I didn't, I'd lost my confidence. I'd lost my academic confidence. So I applied to teacher training college, and I was happy about that because I wanted to be a teacher. I went for my interview in London, and I got through. And then she said, and where would you like to teach? Which part of London? So I said, Bermondsey. And she looked at me and said, do you know London? I said, well, no, not really, but it's the docks, isn't it? Oh, yes, she said, we won't have any difficulty placing you there. So that was where I went. And it was an amazing educational institution. Teachers who were utterly committed. A headmistress who was tough, but very fair. And we cared, the culture was one of real caring for the children, and one where we were pushing them hard. And one of my early experiences, I was asked to invigilate an exam.
Mm-hmm.
Well, what could be easier, And I went to the classroom, and I couldn't get the class to sit down. That's my first problem.
How many people were in the class? How many students?
About 25, 26.
And were they just all over the place?
Girls, yes, and they were chatting and laughing, and I might as well have been a fly on the wall from the notice they were taking of me. And I was getting more concerned as time went on. But there was a girl in the corner, and she was opening and closing, swinging this window and banging it. So I asked her, please, would she sit down? And she took no notice. So I started to walk towards her, at which point the class quietened down. He knew what was coming, I think. And I said, please, would you sit down? And she shot me at a barrage of abuse. I'd never heard.
Which we can't repeat here.
New to me, very new. And I was shocked, and I basically lost control, I think, of that. And the exam didn't get taken. So I was in a school exam, so I thought I'd better go to the headmistress and confess. And she asked me if I wanted to teach the girl one-on-one, which I found an extraordinary request.
Terrifying.
Terrifying, actually, yes. I mean, she was knee-high to a grasshopper child, but nevertheless. And I learned so much from her. I learned so much. She became my protector in the school. We worked together. I taught her to read and write. If you get any trouble, madam, she'd say, with any girl, you just tell me, because I'll sort her out.
Oh, my gosh. But you said you taught her to read and write.
I taught her to read and write. And she was a Turkish Cypriot girl. They'd come from Cyprus, which was, there was a civil war raging.
Yes.
Her brothers and her father had stayed to fight. And of course, she was very brave with them. She'd left everything she'd known. And she lived in a high-rise with her mum, who barely left the flat. And she couldn't accept this exam paper. She couldn't read it. So, of course, she needed to get some kudos from her peers. The only way was to challenge a teacher. But she was feisty and funny and humorous, and she had enormous potential. And she was very worried about the fact that I wasn't married. So she would tell me that the local greengrocer, was interested, and was I interested in a date? So she and I became very friends.
Very good friends.
Yeah. I remember one day on the stairs, she obviously wanted to know who was boss, nevertheless. And it was change of lesson time, and she shouted out, "Madam, did you make that dress?" And I said, "Oh, yes," brightly. She said, "I thought so. It's bleeding awful." And the whole of this stairwell erupted in laughter. But she taught me that we have to understand who's in the classroom.
Absolutely.
We have to understand the children. We have to understand what's going on in their lives outside home and what's gone on in their lives up to that point. And that, for me, is fundamentally what my whole educational philosophy is about. And she taught me so much.
What an extraordinary experience. Absolutely.
I hope she's okay.
I hope she's okay. It sounds like she would be just fine. She's in charge, wherever she is, she's in charge of things. Now, you took a trip to Zimbabwe to do some research.
Yes.
What brought you to Zimbabwe to begin with? And how did you decide that's where you were going to go?
Well, I think, as I said, I lost my academic confidence in school, and I'd sort of rediscovered it a bit. And I wanted to prove myself. So I embarked on an MA in London. I enjoyed it so much, and I wanted to extend that, perhaps even beyond that. And I'd gone to Zimbabwe to do field work. My supervisor had looked at what happened after revolutionary struggles to women. Of course, Zimbabwe was now 10 years into independence. What was happening to the women? Were they still involved in a political struggle, or had they been pushed aside? Which tended to be the experience certainly in Latin America. And I went to look at the issue of the exclusion of girls from education. Obviously, education was my great interest. So I prepared, as I thought, in every way I could, reading everything I could about the context and about the issue of girls' exclusion from school. And I went to a village on the western edge of Zimbabwe, Mola, the Nyaminami district, where the Tonga people were living.
My goodness. And you told me once that there was a marvelous man, the chief, who received you in Mola, who was also a very unusual man in terms of being a very strong leader, very committed to his people. And he took you in.
He did. Oh, he did. I was white, clearly. My white skin, the only white person in the community. I came from a country that was responsible for taking everything from the Tonga people when the Kariba Dam was built in the colonial period. His own father had been involved in the political struggle. And yet, he welcomed me and somehow trusted me. And I had enormous respect for him and the way he thought about the community as a whole. He was really instrumental in giving me the confidence to move forward. And one of the first things was a community meeting. He said, we'll have a meeting, which I thought it was going to be a fairly small affair in a school, and it was going to happen 2 days hence. And I woke up that morning, a lot of noise outside and lots of people walking on the road. And I joined the throng. People had their shoes hung around their necks, to save the leather, their hats, some of their best clothes on. And when I got to the school, I found this was the meeting.
Oh, wow. They were all there.
They were there. The chief had called the community, and we were there to discuss the issue of girls' exclusion from education and how girls could be brought into the system. And
what did you learn? What did you hear?
It was a profound lesson in democracy, a profound lesson. People stood up to speak, men, women, old, young. The men sat together, the women sat together. And it was the most extraordinary arena. Cloudless blue sky, backdrop of these blue hazed hills. People wearing colourful cloth. People with caps saying, the San Francisco Yacht Club. These second-hand market in second-hand things. And were listened to with, everybody was listened to quietly. The children were quiet and well behaved. And we basically that day forged what became the CAMFED model of community, full community engagement, committee basis for decision making. And I had never before witnessed such a broad decision-making forum. So yes, it was he. And of course, he asked if I'd speak. Well, everything was happening in Tonga, so I had a wonderful young man, a translator, called Tamias Manyepa. Tamias turned to me going to have to speak now. And they listened. People listened, and I thought, what do they think I am? You know, they probably think I'm wealthy, you know, with fancy car and a big house. And indeed, I was living a privileged life. So I decided to tell them about my grandmother, who'd left school when she was 12. And at the end, gosh, it makes me emotional thinking about it.
It's okay,
at the
take
end,
a moment.
when people came up to me to shake my hand, and I felt I was beginning to cross a bridge. I was beginning to cross a bridge to understanding, because I had arrived thinking I understood. And how wrong was I? I was embarrassed. I thought, how arrogant was I to think I could study this problem from outside and arrive in this community with questions and questionnaires. So I accepted with deep humility that I knew nothing.
And yet, Anne, that arrogance, not yours, because you clearly had the humility to come and listen and to just be and to connect with people. I'm referring to the arrogance within the development community, where we assume we know, we think we have the answers, we judge why girls are out of school. And certainly at that time, the prevailing view is that their parents, that culture, locks girls out of school. And you found something altogether different.
You know, there was so much money being spent on persuasion at that time. There were endless videos being made to persuade parents to go to school. And speaking of arrogance, I went to see a very senior education advisor and to question this strategy. And I said, do you realize that people don't have electricity, let alone TV sets? And he looked at me and I said, and if they do, they're sending their daughters to school because they can. How? He said. How do we manage your passion? He said to me. Anyway.
Your passion.
My passion. But I found that waste so wrong. In the context of such need, because the community told me, you know, as one, the chief said, we want our daughters to go to school. The teachers, grandmothers who'd never set foot in a school themselves, parents, with one voice said, we want our daughters to go to school. And when I returned with this message to discuss it, the community told you what they wanted you to hear, which was clearly errant nonsense. But they were just holding fast to this idea. And how could there be an economic line below which parents didn't care about the education of their daughters? Made no sense. So what was happening? And what was happening, of course, was the fact that boys had a much better chance of paid work. And they had much more freedom to travel. They could go to town in search of work without there being too much fear for their safety. Girls were not considered safe, quite rightly so. So in a context where the security was the family, there was no social security coming from the state, or pensions, where you grew what you ate. The children were the coming security. So a choice was forced. But when the opportunity was offered, the girls
went to school. The girls went to school. Now I'm going to enter a whole other terrain with your experience in Zimbabwe. You had a powerful experience there, part of which you have shared with us. But you also connected to people, and you connected to a particular woman. And something about that experience unlocked something you were carrying deep inside.
Yes.
Would you share that?
Yes. I'd come down from the chief's place with Tamias, who was he was my right hand and helped me through everything and translating. And in the distance, we could see a woman sitting outside her hut. And it was unusual that she didn't sort of get up to greet us or make any indication of our arrival, because that would have been more normal behavior. And he said to me, her baby has died, which, was very, very sad. And I looked at her, we got up to her, and I recognized myself. Because grief, deep grief, is not about expressions, and a kind of energetic wailing, or it robs you of the energy to express itself. And I saw that in her. I saw her complete, almost absence of emotion, because you are drained of almost drained of feeling. You haven't got the capacity to feel because what's happened is so immense. And I said to Tamias, who didn't know my experience, I said, please tell her that I too have lost a baby. And he told her, and at that point, for the first time, she looked up. And she said, as he translated, I didn't know that white women's babies died. And it was like a stab to the heart. And somehow, things started to coalesce in my mind, because my husband and I had wanted to do something in memory of our daughter.
Of Catherine.
Of Catherine. She had died from a medical blunder. Her lungs were immature. They couldn't absorb enough oxygen when she was 8 weeks old. And of course, she had the best treatment when she was, in those 8 weeks. And of course, I knew the connection between education, girls' education, and maternal health and child survival. And somehow, I was beginning now to draw on that. And that meeting started a healing process for me, because I had buried a lot of the pain and got on. I had 3 children, I was busy. And it became a source of courage, actually, and empathy and connection. Because wherever we are, and whatever our circumstances, these human experiences
Connect us.
they unite us.
They
unite us. My vulnerability and hers were the same. And that was that was a profound experience at that moment. And it gave me clarity about how to move forward.
Clarity, courage, determination. So you came home, and not too long after that, you started an organization called CAMFED. If I recall correctly, you started by supporting 32 girls in Zimbabwe. Talk about those early days, setting up an organization dedicated to girls' education.
Yes, well, there was an absence of an organisation dedicated to girls' education. I was looking for an organisation that would almost provide an umbrella, but in the absence of that, I realised I had to move forward myself, because I also had to convince people that the girls would go to school. Because I was still being told, well, they might start, but then they'll be pulled out by their parents when they realise they've lost their labour, etc., etc. This was the kind of, conversations I was having. So the only way was to demonstrate it. From a moral perspective, I felt I absolutely needed to act, but also from an intellectual perspective, I needed to have a demonstration of the reality of the truth that the community told me. The sector was filled with organizations where there would be an expat head, generally white, maybe the deputy as well. The differentials in pay were extreme. They would send their children home to a home country, and then there would be people would be recruited locally, and I felt this was a problem. I felt I wasn't interested in setting up an organisation that followed that pattern. So I established CAMFED in the UK, and simultaneously in Zimbabwe, each with a board of trustees. In Zimbabwe, the chair of the board was the permanent secretary of education, Dr. Isaiah Sabanda, who was a wonderful ally and encouragement at that time. So I was challenging the norms, if you like, of
Yes,
the
completely.
industry was set up, and being told it wouldn't work, that the idea of decision-making being held at the community level, I'd see the money go astray. I remember one conversation where I was told, there'd be so much corruption in the community that nothing would happen. And I said, well, it's a strange context when there's so much corruption and that there's so much poverty. Why is there so much poverty if there's so much corruption? And he just looked at me and didn't really have an answer, but just thought I was going to... Yes, I was going to fail, and he was going to be able to rub his hands and say, I told you so. So right from the outset, right from that first meeting in Mola with the chief, the whole foundation of it was about decisions being taken by the community. I mean, I lived in the UK. I wasn't moving to Zimbabwe. So if it was going to work, it had to work with this local democratic decision-making. And it worked. It has worked. It continues to work. I was told that committee members wouldn't contribute, wouldn't participate unless they were paid. And this is 30 years later. No committee member in 6 countries has ever been paid, and they are committed to the work. They are committed to supporting the most vulnerable children in their midst. They take pride in the success because they've had such a hand in the success of the children. So why does it always seem that money mediates these relationships and money mediates human behavior? Because there is so much else. And so the foundations of CAMFED were laid in those early months and years and have held.
I remember when we began working with you and with CAMFED, that one of the most important lessons you said is you're going to have to learn to trust the local communities, the local grandmother in a particular village, because she'll be looking out not just for her granddaughter, but for all the girls. What struck us as just profoundly powerful was the governance structure. It was all centered around that girl. It was the community, it was the school mother who was in the classroom, or the mother, I don't know what you call it, the teacher mother, the teacher mentor in the classroom who looked out for the girls and just ensured that girls thrived. And if they didn't show up for school, who went back to ask what happened.
Yes.
And to make sure that they were fine and they could come back to school. So that was really, really profound in terms of the governance structure. And there's such transparency, absolute transparency in terms of what a girl who was going to school needed to have: her shoes, her books, her uniform. And if something was missing, her mother or her grandmother felt quite empowered to make sure that wasn't missing, that she received it. So it's an amazing model.
Yes.
In terms of structure, transparency, and good governance all around.
Yes.
And you had incredible success in Zimbabwe, more than demonstrated. You essentially defied conventional wisdom and put a new model in place. There must have been some amazing women and men you encountered in Zimbabwe. Would you tell us about them?
Extraordinary people. Judith Kamiri was one, and the late Judith Kamiri, extraordinary woman. She was the headmistress, Mola Secondary School. She arrived, she wasn't there for my first visit, but she was there for the next. And she was only 23.
Oh, wow.
She'd arrived to become a headmistress because Zimbabwe was training as fast as possible. There were only 60 places for every 1,000 black children in a segregated education system in the colonial period.
Oh my.
They had a massive challenge. Fei Chung, the Minister of Education, extraordinary woman, really led the massive expansion. And so there was Judith in a very remote area. she taught me so much about, the dignity, the dignity of people working to really elevate their sense of themselves, to welcome, people into the school, to welcome the barefoot grandmother who'd never stepped over a school threshold, and make her feel important, be listened to. She went out to families to teach them. If you see a tick in your child's exercise book, good, that means good. So good. People didn't understand the symbols of education. And she attended weddings and funerals. She became part of the community. She was loved. When she arrived, they thought, who have they sent us? They've sent us a woman. They've sent us a young woman. And really, she transformed. She transformed education in that community. I remember one day being in her office, this little cubbyhole, and a child came in with a message. She was speaking to him in Tonga, and she spoke to him harshly. And I asked her afterwards, I said, what's the matter? What did you say? She said, I told him to come smartly dressed tomorrow. Now, this was such a poor place. Water was in short supply. And of course, my natural inclination was to be sympathetic. I said, oh, goodness me. And she said, if children bear the marks of poverty, they will inherit the scars. My goodness, she was a philosopher and a poet. I've always remembered the power of that. So it wasn't about saying, oh, my dear, don't worry. It was about saying, we can do this. We can do this. You have dignity. Take pride. Take pride in your home. Take pride in your family. Take pride in yourself, because you can do it. Now come to school smartly dressed tomorrow. And that, I wasn't meeting people like this at home. And I felt I was in a context of humanity, a sort of the type of humanity that was full of generosity and goodness. People would tell me things not because they wanted some accolade, but because they wanted to give a message about a child. They would say, well, she lives 5 miles from here, and I walked up to her home, but they didn't even have blankets, so I got blankets for them, and they would tell me not because, they wanted me to think well of them, but because they wanted me to understand. And that's what counts. How do you behave towards people who are more vulnerable than you? It's easy enough to behave in a particular way to people with more status and authority, but how do you behave to people who are more vulnerable when you're not being watched?
When you're not being watched.
And that is what I saw, and that is what I heard. And that was what the whole thing depended upon. So it attracted those people. It attracted those people who wanted change, who wanted to make a difference. And it had a kind of a culture of care with the child, as you say, at the centre. Yes, it was extraordinary for me personally, but it was a demonstration model of how communities can take charge and work in a way that's so compassionate and caring. And when that grandmother comes into the school and feels that she can approach the head teacher and say, my granddaughter hasn't yet received her school skirt, that's change.
Yeah.
And we need to celebrate that.
Absolutely.
That is not something, say, oh dear, 10% of the school skirts didn't seem to arrive, so that gets somehow modified on a report to a donor. No, it's grandmothers came into the school to find out,
where are the skirts?
Where's the skirts?
Yeah, where are the skirts?
Brilliant, because the service is for them.
Yes.
We are providing a service, and we are answerable to them, not the other way around.
Yeah. I think the other big myth that's out there, which you also busted completely, was the incredible generosity, the great philanthropy that comes from these very households who have so little.
Yes.
I remember once you told me about a school teacher just reached into her pocket and paid for a child's fees because she didn't want that child to be sent home.
Yes. Yes.
And you must have seen that time and time again.
Yes. Yes, I saw it. I saw it time and time again, and it reminded me of my childhood. I wondered, I thought, can this generosity not exist in wealthy communities?
Yes.
Do we just move beyond empathy and sympathy and compassion as we move towards greater wealth? Because during the general strike in 1926, my grandfather was on strike with the miners in South Wales. And they can sing, in Wales, so the Welsh male voice choirs were going around the country, collecting money from people sympathetic in the working classes and bringing the money home. And meanwhile, this army of women, including my grandmother, were making meals for the children. During the general strike, they made 217,000 meals.
Oh my gosh. Wow.
This very poor community. And I used to keep finding these parallels. I was in Malawi, and it was a preschool, and the women giving their time and their resources to provide food for the preschool children. And I noticed that some of the children were getting extra rations. So I asked the women, why are the children getting extra rations? And the woman said to me, because those are the children who were most hungry. And I said, how do you know? And she said, because they eat the fastest. And I thought, I've never seen that in a report, in an academic report. And there it was, the knowledge that's so crucial.
Absolutely.
Coming from a poor community in Malawi of women who had not been to school, but who understood children's needs. And I just kept finding these parallels in my own background in Wales and what I was seeing in Africa. And I remember one day meeting a woman called Dorcas, and she was disabled and she was in a wheelchair, and she invited me to her home. And when we got there, she literally climbed down out of her wheelchair and crawled inside, and she had a lot of fabric spread out on the floor, and she said, I'm making clothes for people in the community because I'm supporting orphan children. And she had adopted 12 orphans herself as a single woman, and that she was now providing for their food, for their educational expenses, all herself. And I've never seen such a profound act of
devotion and philanthropy.
And devotion and love. But it's somehow in our sector, in development, and words like, you don't find words like love and compassion and empathy in reports. You find a lot of the technical jargon and data. And what are the stories? What are the stories that behind what is happening? These are not some sort of sidebar, to give a report a bit of emotional heft. These are biographies which tell us detail of what's happening. And I've always found stories to be a huge source of understanding, and also of acknowledgement, to honor people who are doing, really doing the work on the front line, who are often so marginalized or taken for granted. Yes, it's I've gone around this a little bit, haven't I? Lots of different
beautifully
things into my mind.
Beautifully, and I'm glad. These are all very important things which need to be said. There's incredible demand for, and I say in quotations, data, and for analytics, and yet we have really no insight into what's really happening unless we listen, engage, and invite these stories for people to speak about their lives and what's changing or what's not. Otherwise, the data's, frankly, it's just meaningless.
Well, the data is often flawed too,
and it's flawed.
There's not a deep understanding of the gathering process, or even of the language. I think the language of development has a lot to answer for. I think the word beneficiary is hugely problematic and suggests something top down, and a relationship of giving and gratitude. Whereas these are our clients. These are the reason the reason we work. We work for the children or the community. Capacity building is another one I really can't abide. Whose capacity is being built here, and why? There is so much. There is so much that is beyond money. There's so much capital of different kinds. The institutional capital that needs to be honoured and accessed and used and brought into work. There's the social capital of the community, the human capital, of course, but somehow money is seen as the key driver. So the money and the data seem to drive, held as the most important factors in this, and it's inadequate. It's inadequate
and distortive.
Yes.
And it's distortive.
It distorts relationships.
That's something we need to. I was trying to find the right word myself. Restate, resettle, rebalance altogether, and to make sure that human beings come first in all of this. Now, speaking about CAMFED, so by this time, you've gone well beyond the demonstration effect. You've actually created a movement. CAMFED operates in 5 countries. But those girls, once they finish their education, and they go on to either further education or they get into the workforce, there's something else. And you've enabled and helped foster an alumni network, which you call CAMA. And they are formidable. Will you speak about them?
Formidable is extraordinary. It's a movement. It truly is. I was really losing sleep over this because the girls were leaving school, about to leave school. What then? This was at a time in the late 90s when HIV and AIDS were raging, decimating communities, and adolescent girls, some of the most infected and affected. And of course, they'd gone through secondary school, so the question was, what next? And there was an absence of jobs and opportunities and training in rural communities. And so they would be tempted to go to town in search of work, which was very, very dangerous, because at almost the minute they stepped off the buses, there would be offers which would look perhaps like work in hotels or domestic homes, which would be often an opening to abuse. And so I put it to the board that we needed to go beyond, and the board was very reluctant. I said, no, we're having success. We can't be overly ambitious. This is an area that we don't know anything about. Well, I hadn't known anything about girl education, so, why not? I really fought very hard. And Robert Oakeshott, who was, a major ally, he said to me years later, I've never been so happy to be proved wrong, because it has become formidable and a force. And I was on a platform in Cambridge. I had been invited to speak to the students at Trinity College. And I was looking out thinking, my goodness, what a privileged group, and even when they leave, they're going to have networks and opportunities that, are available to them. And I thought, we need to mimic the behaviors of the elite. And we need to create an alumni for rural girls in Africa. And it was for them, really, initially. The idea was to give them a support system on leaving school. But how? The reality was that they were had such deep understanding of the reality of exclusion. They had such empathy that already in their lives they were doing what they could. They would meet a child at a bus stop, and the child would say, "Why aren't you at school?" And they would explain, and they would find a way. And so, what CAMA became was not my vision. It was absolutely their own. I don't think it was even their vision, but it was them. It was who they were as human beings, what they determined to do in their lives with their education. And so now, of course, the older ones are probably in their early 40s, and they are, positions of influence. There's a diaspora. They're in Canada, they're in the United States, they're in Europe, and of course across Africa. And they are influencers of the systems that they participate in. Angeline Morimirwa, she is the head of CAMFED now. She's one of the first in getting support. Charismatic. She understands what it is to be a barefoot child and go to secondary school. Go to a secondary school that that got electric lights that she's switching on for the first time. They've lived through that experience. Runyararo Machingaitsi, she challenged every expectation of the school she was in, of a rural girl. She was one of the first of the 32 by coming top of all the girls in the school. Now, this was a school largely for the middle class of the growing middle class of the cities of Zimbabwe. But there was no local school she could walk to. So she went to a school which was well-resourced, and she worked. She worked so hard. And she not only became top of the 21 who had been supported into the school.
So the entire school.
The entire complement of girls. And she's a doctor in Namibia now. She's working there in a hospital. And she said to me, when I see an old woman, and I see a nurse being a bit, disrespectful or dismissive, I say to her, don't speak to that woman that way. She could be my grandmother. She said they're shocked because they don't think that, doctor in a white coat came from that background. So they are changing the institutions that they're part of. They are involved in every kind of area. Fiona Muchemberry, who is the head of CAMA, she is the first trained lawyer. Remarkable. We have agricultural extension workers. We have people training others in agriculture, in managing climate change. Through Earth University, of course, another partner that works on sustainable agriculture. They are occupying every facet of their national economy and lives, and yet they remain rooted. One of the most profound messages of the early years of CAMA was of the pride. Pride in your roots. Never turn your back. Never feel that your families haven't got you to where you are. And I think that is extraordinarily important for self-confidence,
Self-esteem,
for identity. So many people hide their backgrounds. When I've spoken about this aspect, I've had people come up to me telling me quietly. I was in a very fancy event in New York, and a woman, and I spoke at that, and the woman came up to me and told me like it was a secret she wanted to hide, that her mother was a shop girl in Macy's, and she'd worked so hard for her daughter to have a good education. That holds people back when they feel like imposters.
Absolutely.
The success that they feel, the success has come to them, not by dint of their capability and their hard work, but then they feel like imposters. It makes them far less powerful. CAMA members have that power, and that is extraordinary to listen to. And they are over 250,000 strong now.
I was going to say, and what's equally extraordinary is just how large this CAMA network is. And so much of what we've talked about, the generosity of people who in some cases have the least to give, but yet have the greatest love and generosity which they express. We've talked about the misplace assumptions which are just dead wrong in the development community about communities they think they know,
Yes.
but really don't.
Yes.
And so much of our work is to shift what is outdated
Yes.
in this development sector in order for there to be development. What's your advice to this sector or to foundations like ours, which need to change how this work is being undertaken?
That's a very, very big question. Peter. I think one thing I have found challenging is the recruitment of people, not in Africa, but in the UK. The education systems, of course, are competitive, and they're about, solving problems. So bright young people, they want to change the world. They know the world needs changing, but they think they have to come up with the solutions. So it's about really drawing in people, recruiting people who have those skills. They're called soft skills, but they're fundamentally important skills of listening and learning from people who are the real experts on the front line, experiencing the day-to-day problem. So I think we have to look at, how we train and how we recruit. Certainly in this sector, I think that's very important. And I think we have to acknowledge the scale of the problem with humility. We have to take our, we have to be brave about recognizing that we don't have the answers. I remember in Mola, I took my questionnaires, which were only printed on one side, to the local school and said, would you like this paper? Because it's only printed on one side. And the headmaster said, thank you. We haven't got any unlined paper. The children would enjoy drawing on unlined paper. And I felt free. I started to learn at that moment when I abandoned all my preconceptions, which were born of arrogance, of my arrogance. So we need to abandon our presumptions that we know and have the answers and go and listen and learn and trust what people are saying to us.
Thank you. Thank you, Anne. That's just incredible.
Anne Cotton's life and career exemplify the extraordinary impact that one individual can have in transforming access to education and empowering generations. As a mother and grandmother, Anne's journey is deeply personal, yet her work has touched millions of lives across continents. From her roots in Wales to her groundbreaking work in rural Zimbabwe, from teaching in deprived areas of London to founding CAMFED, from grassroots mobilization to influencing global education policies. Anne Cotton has redefined what is possible through vision and empathy. By going beyond mistaken assumptions to observing what was real, by connecting to women and families and seeing what they wanted for their daughters. She has inspired a movement that is supporting girls' education across Africa, a movement that is transcending boundaries. Anne Cotton is proof that the power of one can create a legacy of change for millions.